Welcome. That was a bit odd, wasn't it? Well, welcome to this week's seminar on myths and origins. Today I want to consider place names, and I want you to think about place names. What do they mean? What connotations do they have? And particularly, how important are they for identity? What I'll do first of all is have a look at the stuff that I've got on the VLE for you to look at, and have a quick discussion of the different sources that I have there, because there are different avenues in place names that you might want to follow, or you might just find place names fascinating per se and want to follow up some of the reading. So we'll go through that first, and then I want to give you a PowerPoint seminar on Shetland place names, and look particularly at the range and nature of Shetland place names, and look at how they are part of Shetland identity today. I don't know whether you've ever considered place names before, but they are a rather interesting topic in their own right, and they're all mixed up with origins. People wonder what place names mean. They're very much associated with place. Think about the places that you've grown up and lived, and their names. Think about songs that have place names in them. They have the connotation of a place. You know, they make you think of a place. And of course, places and identity are intimately linked. Place names are also a fascinating source for historical research, and that's where I came into place names myself. I was very interested to know what place names could tell us about the languages that were spoken in parts of Scotland before the present day, and what they could tell us about the different movements of people and the change in ethnicity in different areas. I think for you who are from Australia and North America, place names are a fascinating subject, because they are colonial place names, most of them. The ones that have come from Europe, of course, have come with people, but there are also native names there as well, some of which have been borrowed. And I wonder how you think about names like Mississippi or Uluru. Do these have interesting connotations for you? Maybe that's something you could follow up in the discussion after watching this recording. Think about place names in your own context, your own countries, and some of the debates that have taken place about place names. Also, you know, what sorts of place names do you get in your own particular areas? Are they descriptive names, or are they names that have been brought over by colonisers and don't actually have any apparent relevance to any given place, but people took them with them because they were important to them? So yeah, have a discussion about that afterwards. But obviously today we're going to concentrate on the place names of the Northern Isles and see what they can tell us about the history of the Northern Isles, and of course about identity. So I'm just going to check to see if the system's working. Okay, of course I have to imagine that you're out there, and I have to imagine that you're responding to what I say. So if it does seem a bit stilted at times, please forgive me. There we go. Ah, it is working. Okay. Right, if you have a look at the VLE, you'll find various things that I've included there for you to look at. The seminar notes will be up, so please have a read of them. If you have a chance to read them before next week, that would be very good. I'll just check that they're available. Hang on a second. Yes, they are. They're not under any sort of time switch or anything of that sort. So the seminar notes will discuss some of the earliest names associated with the Northern Isles. The name Shetland is an interesting case in point. It is actually a Norse name, but it may have an earlier origin and been borrowed into Norse. Might have a look at that shortly. And the name Orkney again, it's a Norse form of a much older name that goes back to the classical world. The Orcades, or the islands of the Orc people, were known to the classical authors. And this was a sort of, we were discussing Thule last week. Well, the Orcades were beyond Britain, you know, towards the north into the nearly over the horizon, as it were. But we do get the word Orcades turning up. So we know that that we have a place name in origin that goes back before the Viking Age. It's an interesting one, actually, Orcades. A great scholar of Scottish place names, William Watson, a great scholar of Celtic languages, was able to come up with an etymology for that. All Celtic languages are Indo-European languages, but what distinguishes them from other Indo-European languages, well, one thing amongst many, but a particular thing that identifies them, is that they lost the initial P of most Indo-European languages. So the Indo-European root for the word father was something like pater, which gave pater in Latin, but in Celtic the P disappeared and it gives us modern Gaelic ahar, so the P has gone. So he looked at the name Orkney and he did a little bit of lateral thinking, and he realised that a P had fallen off the front from the Indo-European root, and that in fact the origin of that lay behind orc was the Indo-European word pork, for pig. So it's generally accepted this now that the very earliest origin of Orkney is the islands of the pig people. That doesn't seem terribly gratifying. However, pork, wild boars were high status animals in Celtic society. So to be associated with an animal like that was actually a noble thing. But the point for our purposes is that this name that lies behind Orkney is pre-Norse, so it's a Celtic name. So we can assume that the people who lived in Orkney, and by extension Shetland, before the Vikings arrived, spoke some form of the Celtic languages. So the seminar notes deal with questions like that. There's one or two other interesting little things in there. References to possibly the Anglo-Saxons having some influence in Orkney. I quash that in the notes, but have a read anyway. There is an old reference from a 9th century source that Hengist and Horsa, if you know your Anglo-Saxon history, who are reputed to be the two war leaders who initiated the Anglo-Saxon takeover of England, they raided the lands of the Picts and laid waste Orkney. So there has been a debate, in fact a book published suggesting that before the Vikings there were Anglo-Saxons settled in Orkney, but very unlikely. It's a book by Graham Davis, The Early English Settlement of Orkney and Shetland. So have a little look at that as well, but have a look at that from the perspective of how would that change things if we imagined that there'd been an Anglo-Saxon settlement in Orkney and Shetland before the Vikings. Would that change people's point of view? The realisation that there were pre-Viking Celtic-speaking peoples in the Northern Isles also has ramifications for the way that people think of themselves. And it can't really be claimed that there were no Celtic-speaking people in the Northern Isles before the Vikings. There's good evidence from the place names for that. I suppose the other aspect of things that I discuss in some depth in the notes is the origin of the place name Shetland itself. Now, I wrote an article on this that took about 2 years to write. Actually, it was one of these articles that was a long time in the gestation. The reason being that I wanted to contact as many people as possible who could help me, or at least I could discuss the etymology with. And then I also, before publishing the paper, did a talk in Aberdeen University to the Scandinavian department there about the ideas in it, and also I went to a place name etymological conference in Halden in Norway as well, and talked about this potential etymology of the name there as well, and got people's reactions to it, and then incorporated it all in the final paper that was published. And to cut a long story short, I mean, you can have a look at the paper yourselves and see what you think. I was arguing that Hjaltland, which is the Old Norse form of the name Shetland, the origin of the name, in fact, was a Viking coining, but in fact it was based on the name of the people who used to live in Shetland before the Vikings got here, the Hjaltar. So there's quite a bit of information in the paper about that. And in fact, I went back even further and tried to work out who the Hjaltar might have been. So there's several different possible etymologies of the name there. It's just possible that the name comes from Caledones, the people who lived in what's now Scotland in the Iron Age and at the time of the Romans, or it's also possible that it comes from the word Celt. So you can have a look at both of these options. I suppose that's not really so important. What is quite interesting is that the Norse coinage of Hjaltland seems to refer to a people, and that's quite an early form of place name. There are several land place names in Scandinavia which refer to people. So Gotland is the land of the Goths. Rogaland in Norway is the land of the Rugi, a tribe who live there. The Hordaland, which is just across from us here, in the Bergen is part of Hordaland, is the land of the Hörðar, and so on and so forth. So it could be quite an old name, in fact a pre-Viking Age name, so an evidence of contact between Norway and Shetland before the Viking Age. The this using of a people and a land, the land of a certain people, is many of them date back to 400 or 500 AD. When the Viking settlers started to move across towards the west, they coined other land names like Iceland and Greenland and Helluland and Vinland, but all of those have a geographical feature as their specific rather than the name of people. So the fact that Shetland has the name of people is an interesting one, and of course we can't be absolutely certain that it's a pre-Viking name, because we also have names like Scotland and Ireland and England, the names of the land of the Scots and the Irish and the English, and these were used by the Norse as well. So it's not entirely proven that Hjaltland is a pre-Viking name, but nonetheless it could be. But I suppose from the idea of identity is rather interesting, because what we have, if you think of it, and the connotations exist in the modern form of the name as well. If you come from Shetland, you come from a land, okay? And people in Shetland talk about going to Scotland, in fact. So they consider Shetland to be on a par with Scotland, and that's what the place name actually infers. Orkney is slightly different. People like to have it singular today, but Orkneyar, the Old Norse form of it, is actually a plural name. But people don't like to do that, to mention that nowadays. It's nice and singular, but it's slightly different because, I would argue slightly different. The feeling of going from a land called Shetland to another land called Scotland is slightly different from going from the islands of Orkney to Scotland. There is something that plays in the mind slightly about that. hang on a second. I'll just stop sharing that and just check. Hold up.
Oh, it's not recording now.
Where's the button? Where's the thing?
No, there's no red thing. It's been recording now, so am I.
Okay.
See that first one?
Hang on, what's this thing then?
It means it's recording, but it records no video, but it's recording.
Right, so I'll go share. Okay, hello everybody, I'm still here. So if I'm do that, it did something. It said came up with a wee screen saying a wee thing spinning. I don't know, some odd thing.
No, you're good.
We're okay.
You're good. Yes.
Oh, super. Well, I'm good. Leanne tells me I'm good. That's good. Right. Okay, so anyway, think about that little idea for a moment as well. If the place that you belong to is called a land, does that make does it have some sort of ramifications for the way that you imagine the place that you live? Okay, so have a look at the notes. There are things there that I hope will interest you, and after I have information about Hjaltland itself, I give you some information on the zones of Norse place names. Now, Orkney and Shetland have a very interesting, what's called an onomasticon, so a place name identity. And that is that the place names of Orkney and Shetland are primarily of Old Norse origin. The Vikings, when they came to Orkney and Shetland, effectively renamed everything. There are very few examples, proven examples of names that are older than the Viking age. That means that the people didn't borrow the names from the people who were already there, which obviously has interesting, can create an interesting debate. If they didn't borrow the names, well, what happened to the people who were there before? So, we'll come back to that when I show the PowerPoint, I'm sure. But what is interesting about Orkney and Shetland is that they have this place name identity, which is primarily Norse. Now, that's not to say that the names that exist haven't changed, because they have, because people no longer speak Old Norse, so the names are maintained, but they change gradually as language changes. But what we can do is we can carry out, etymological research into the place names and find out that they're all pretty much Old Norse names in origin. That makes Orkney and Shetland more or less distinct within the context of the British Isles. The Isle of Lewis in the Hebrides, Outer Hebrides, also has a lot of Old Norse names, but if we look at Britain as a whole, we find different zones where there are elements of Old Norse naming, but maybe not to the same extent. So, you can divide it into zones, which has been done by, I've forgotten the name, but an English scholar who went off to Denmark. Well, it doesn't matter. I'll find that from. Oh yes, Gillian Fellows Jensen. That was her name. So she looked at all the Old Norse place names in the British Isles and divided the British Isles into different zones depending on the number and the sort of percentage of Old Norse names. And Orkney and Shetland are the Zone 1. They are the area with the densest concentration of Old Norse names. And of course that has an impact on identity as well. Once you know that you live in a place where all the names are Old Norse, and where you can draw exact parallels with names in Norway or Faroes or Iceland, then of course it has an impact on the way you view yourself and you view the land in which you live. And we mentioned last week the fact that one of the most popular books in Shetland is Jakob Jakobsen's Place Names of Shetland. And the reason is that he provides etymologies for lots of names, so people, wherever they live, they will go to the book and they'll find out what the name means. So it's important to people, and it helps to give people a feeling that they are connected to the Old Norse past. And if you remember last week, we we talked a lot about Nordophilia and people identifying with the Norse past. But when it comes to place names, people can, because the place names of Orkney and Shetland are Old Norse. And the fact that you can draw these direct parallels is very interesting too, so people feel a connection with other places in the north. Connection that they don't feel quite so much, as far as place names are concerned at least, with places to the south. Because once you start moving south into the north of Scotland, you start leaving the Norse names behind. Caithness could be incorporated, included with Orkney and Shetland because of the density of Norse names there. But as you move south into Sutherland, you get less and less Norse names. You can recognise some of them if you know what you're looking for, but what starts to happen is you get a lot more Gaelic place names, so the Gaelic language form of Celtic, so you get more and more of those names. So the names change, the landscape changes, of course, becomes more mountainous, but the place names change too, so you're moving from one sort of cultural zone, as it were, into another. And I think that has quite a big impact on people if they're interested in their own places at home. Okay, right. Have a look at the notes then, and you'll find quite a lot of material that you might want to bring to the discussion. Do you know the origin of the names of the places in which you live? Or are they a sort of a mystery to you? The reason I ask is that place names don't have to have a meaning as such. They function as names, so you can call anything if you want. It's just a place that has a name. So when you find names that have been taken across to the New World from the old, like Glasgow and Inverness and Banff and you name it, lots of these names, it doesn't matter that people don't know what these names mean. They are attached to a place and work quite happily as a tag, if you like. However, when we look at the place names where they are originally created, they do tend to have a meaning as well. So the elements that go into the place name were nouns, often a noun and an adjective, and they had a meaning. They described the landscape in which the place was, as it were. So we'll see that soon. But just think about that from your own context. You'll probably find that the names that were borrowed from the native populations had meaning. Think of some examples of those. But the names that were taken as commemorative names from the old lands, as it were, very rarely have any direct meaning when it comes to their situation, if you like, geographically. So how about we think about that? Have a discussion. Okay, so if we go back just to have a little look at other things. Hang on a second. You can do it. Seminar 3. Okay. Computer says nothing. Right, here we are. Okay. Open it up again. Right. There's a document on Norse place names which goes into a little bit more depth about the Norse place names in the British Isles and puts the place names of Orkney and Shetland into context. And there's also a link to Jakob Jakobsson's 2 lectures on place names. Before he published his book, he did as we all try and do, he gave lectures and got feedback from what people were saying. So you can read those on archive.org. I'd like to recommend archive.org. The amount of stuff there is quite extraordinary, and hang on a second. Some of these things don't like to be opened up in Blackboard, so you might have to right click and we go open a new tab. There we are. have a troll through archive.org. Put in things like Shetland and Orkney and place names and Nordic, and you'll find a whole range of interesting things. Anything that is no longer in copyright, well, not anything, but a lot that's no longer in copyright has been put online on archive.org. You may already know it, but if you don't, it's becoming a library in your own house. And many of the things that were very difficult to get, and in fact made research difficult in the past, are all there for you. So there's nothing to complain about. There's a huge amount of material there for you to explore. But this is a very good piece of research by Jacobsen. So I'd recommend, if you have time, reading through that. Puts it into context. I'm not sure if it's this particular one or a later one where he claims there are some Celtic names in Orkney and Shetland. I would disagree with that and not pay too much attention to it. That idea has since sort of gone out of favour because we can usually find Old Norse etymologies for names that would otherwise seem to be potentially Celtic. Okay. The other article to read is by Brian Smith. Now, he has a very interesting take on the place names of Orkney and Shetland. It is odd that there are no pre-Norse place names in Orkney and Shetland, despite what I just said about Jacobsen there. More recent thinking on the subject by place name scholars has really got rid of that. It's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to identify pre-Norse elements in the place names of Orkney and Shetland. And the question is why? Because again, if you think of the colonising efforts of Europeans all over the world, they borrowed lots of names. Sometimes it's easier to borrow a name than have to coin your own. If there's a river and it's got a name and you're talking to the native inhabitants, you just borrow the name and you pass it on to your the other people that you're talking to. You don't say, oh, they call that Mississippi in their language, we're not going to call it the Thames, and then pass that on to everybody. It can happen, but people are usually lazy and quite happy to, as long as they can pronounce a name, pass that on as the name for that geographical object. But the odd thing is that this didn't seem to happen in Orkney and Shetland. There seems to have been no desire on behalf of the Norse, the renamers, to borrow the pre-existing names. And this is a bit of a problem, and Brian Smith has argued that the reason is that everybody who'd lived in Orkney and Shetland on the eve of the Viking influx was killed, so they didn't pass their names on. Now, some people go with that, but many find that difficult to accept, and wonder if there are other reasons why this might be the case. Certainly, if the people were enslaved, if the number of people coming in, the immigrants coming in from Scandinavia, outnumbered the native population, or at least sort of equalled it, and the native population were put into a much lower social grade, then perhaps the Norse didn't want to borrow names from their thralls or their slaves. So that that could be, or that could be the fact that the population that lived there was so disrupted by the Viking raids and settlements that the whole landscape and settlement areas was changed, and people were moved about and they didn't pass the names on. It's very difficult to know why this might happen, but it is an odd situation. And of course that feeds into identity as well. Do you, if you live in Orkney and Shetland, identify with the people who lived before the Vikings if you can't know the names of that they created for the landscape? If the oldest level of names that you can find in Orkney and Shetland are Old Norse, that's really where the the first identity springs from, as it were, as far as linguistic identity goes. And also, if you do imagine that the place names show us that the pre-existing population was destroyed, well, that has interesting connotations as well when it comes to regard the ancestors, does it not? If the people in Orkney and Shetland of Norse origin, of which there are many, have their origin from the fact that their ancestors destroyed the populations that existed there before, then it has a potentially unsettling impact on one's view of oneself and the area in which you live. So the place names can actually feed into a debate about colonisation and genocide and all sorts of interesting things that you would imagine that something as innocent as place names might do. So have a think about that. That'd be interesting for you to discuss actually once you've watched this. Do pick up on place names in your own areas and how you feel about place names and whether you know what they mean, but also have a discussion about what does it mean for Orkney and Shetland if the place names are evidence for genocide or something along those lines, like ethnic cleansing, or it's a very touchy point, shall we say, but it's still important to discuss. One of the reasons that Brian puts forward is that, as an example of something similar, is the lack of Aboriginal names in Tasmania, which for a long time seemed to be the case, and the suggestion that the Tasmanian population was destroyed by the Europeans. But there's a little bit of debate about that now, and think that people were moved, and some of them actually do know the names. There are people who claim to be at least of mixed Tasmanian origin, and they do have names for some of these places. But it's still it's an interesting comparison and worth exploring. Because even if they weren't all destroyed, a lot of them were, and they were so displaced that they weren't able to pass the names on to their the European colonisers. So there might well be a parallel taking place there. However, of course, it might just be that the people who lived in Orkney and Shetland very quickly became Norse-speaking and, for whatever reason, didn't pass their earlier names on, but re-coined and adopted Norse names. But if that's the case, that's still pretty odd as well, because there's usually a bit of kudos, at least associated with your names, and people do like to pass them on, even if they're of lower class than the other people with other names that come in. So it's definitely a very odd onomastic situation in Orkney and Shetland. So leave that just for the moment. And what I'd like to do now is give you a version of a talk that I'm going to do in Prince Edward Island, which is looking at the place names of Shetland in particular. Now, this could also apply to Orkney as well, a lot of what I'm going to say now. So please, those in Orkney, don't feel that you're being left out in any way. Okay. Now the conference, well, this is not a conference actually, I'm giving this talk to the Institute of Island Studies in Prince Edward Island. And what they're interested in, of course, is islands, but that can include, as well as politics and economics, can include island cultures and island identities. And the focus of this talk is about island identities and how they're expressed through place names. How odd and unusual place naming practices reflect on identity. So Shetland is a good example of this, because Shetland has a quite unique, apart from Orkney of course, but I won't be I don't want to confuse people in Prince Edward Island too much with this. But Orkney and Shetland have unique folklore, onomastic identity. And of course, Orkney is slightly different from Shetland, but they're definitely related. But I thought the best way of starting the talk for our Canadian friends was to give a couple of examples of odd place names. And these could only be associated with the Northern Isles, these names. Very unlikely to find such names anywhere else. So, Fografidal to Giltarump, an exploration of Shetland's onomastic identity. And there are Fografidal and Giltarump on the map. As I've already suggested, but I've been pointing out to folks in Canada, place names are a very important part of folklore and also a very important part of ethnic identity and cultural heritage. And I've got examples here. In fact, the top one there is the longest place name in the British Isles. It's in Wales, and there was an example of the weatherman on Channel 4 using it yesterday. It was handy that he was from Wales, of course, so he was able to pronounce it. But I'll give it a go just in a second. But think about these names. These are names that could only be associated with a given place, and people take it into their identity, and it's part of their ethnicity. So, Llanfairpwll Gwyn Gwyll Gogerich Wyrin Drob Bullwan Tisili Gogogoch. There you go, very poorly pronounced. But it's the great big long name. A similar, even longer name, which I won't even attempt, is a Maori name from New Zealand, which is the longest place name in the world. So people are justly proud of these names. From Scotland, I decided to go to the other side, the other end of the scale. So we've got the A, which is in Dumfries and Galloway, which is quite short, I have to say, and E, which is the Gaelic form of the island of Iona, which is, you can't get any shorter than that. So that must be a competitor for the shortest place name in the world. But place names, the Welsh one, it's in Welsh. Welsh speakers can understand what it means, so it's part of their cultural heritage. Okay. And similarly, the Maori name. Because place names are part of ethnicity, part of ethnic heritage, and they can be problematical. And anyone who has studied colonial history or the history of the Second World War will know of examples like this. So, from Australia, is Ayers Rock Uluru, or can you call it Ayers Rock anymore? Is it only Uluru? The debate about who has the right to name a place and what's the most authentic name for a place. Does a name like Ayers Rock, does that reek of colonialism and the imposition of one culture upon another? So there are lots of similar debates going on all over the world. And of course, place names, because they're a sort of expression of ethnicity, can be caught up in nationalist debates and nationalist struggles. And we don't have to go very far in modern Europe to find examples of places being named and renamed, depending on which ethnic group happens to be the dominant one at any given time. So, is it Gdansk or Danzig? Or is it both? Well, officially I think it's Gdansk. But, there's the debate going on there. A similar one could be a political one, in the sense that do you name a place, the renaming of places like St. Petersburg, Leningrad, what's called Petrograd. There you go. It was Petrograd, then it was Leningrad, and now it's St. Petersburg. Names have connotations of political meaning as well. And because they can have political implications, and they can cause problems between different groups, the United Nations does have an interest, does take an interest in place names and in mapping and standardising how people do things. So there is actually an organisation, part of the United Nations, called UNGEGEN, which looks into lots of different aspects of naming. And I've got a friend who's a place name scholar in Denmark and who's also on this board. I'm sure you can come up with lots and lots of examples of how place names cause friction in different parts of the world, and perhaps in your parts of the world. So far in Scotland they haven't generated too much debate, although there has been some. And here's some examples here. So there is a continual sort of griping from the unionist quarters that too much money is spent on bilingual signage. So you'll find lots of arguments about that. There you go, there's a little campaign slogan. SNP has spent £26 million on Scottish Gaelic road signs, a language that less than 1% of the population can understand. So signage, of course, is important because you can put different versions of names on it, and you can perhaps you would think that would please everybody, because you can get a sign and you can get your Gaelic version of a name and you can get your English version on it. So you would think that would make everybody happy, but apparently not. Only English versions of the names, I think we can use that term, should be on road signage, according to some people. And similarly, sort of for cultural reasons, people of Caithness don't want Gaelic names on their signs, or Gaelic forms of their names, even to the extent of anti-Gaelic gunmen taking pot shots at the signs in Caithness. So names embody identity and culture, so if you don't like that culture and identity, then it can cause problems. One thing about Caithness, of course, is that Gaelic was spoken well up into the north of Caithness, maybe not to the very northeastern corner, but lots of the area of the county of Caithness spoke Gaelic as well. So there's every reason for the place names to be in two different forms, two different versions on the signs. But it hasn't caused too much problem yet in Scotland, just occasional griping and groaning from people who should know better, I would say. But it might be a problem if they tried to bring in Gaelic names for places in Shetland and put them on signs, because there isn't really any justification for that. What does Shetland actually have then? It has names that, if you visit, you will feel that you're in a unique place. You know, this is what you see when you arrive, and when you're driving down the road, you see the names on signs, and you think, oh, that's interesting. It's not just fields and hills and the coast. There are actually these names as well, and they're different from what you're likely to be used to, and that gives you an immediate impression that you're somewhere different, somewhere with a unique identity. And some of the names are quite fun, like Buddabrick and Noosthammer and Burrowfirth. Most of these were taken up in Unst a couple of weeks ago. But the initial impression is, okay, somewhere different. And the reason is, of course, that the origins of the names are from Old Norse, and most of the other parts of Scotland, they're not. So you get this immediate feeling that you're seeing something different. So the Vikings arrive in Orkney and Shetland, talking about Shetland in this talk, of course, around 800, or from 800, shall we say, and they rename everything, and they they create their own names for all the geographical features of the islands. And that, of course, is distinctive. We have an area where you have direct contact with the Norse world. I've just got a little note there that there are no equivalents, as far as we know, of commemorative names. So Mississippi or Ballarat or Manhattan or Ottawa. So there are no obvious examples of borrowing from the previous population, as I mentioned before in the earlier part of this seminar. The Norse could have borrowed names just like anybody else, but they didn't, or not obviously anyway. If they did borrow some, they changed them so much that they're unrecognisable as belonging to a different type of language. There are also no commemorative names either. So the first lot, they're borrowed names. There are no borrowed names, and there are no commemorative names. Just to go back to borrowed names. If we assume that the population of Orkney and Shetland spoke languages related to mainland Scotland, we would have expected to find similar place names. So Celtic place names. Because Celtic place names have survived on the mainland of Scotland despite language change. But what makes Orkney and Shetland different is the fact that these names don't appear. So you don't find names, or very few anyway, starting with Dun or Kim or Slieve. These sort of names that you find lots of on the mainland. You don't find them. So the lack of them is also interesting, and that makes it distinctive as well. So it doesn't seem to belong to the same place name dialect, if you like. I'd say there's very few obvious commemorative names either. So we have a settlement taking place, a colonisation of Vikings into Orkney and Shetland, but we don't get these commemorative names. People don't bring Bergen and Trondheim and what the equivalents. You don't find them appearing in the islands, which suggests that when the Vikings came here, they actually wanted to name things, features in the landscape as they were. So the names, of course, are in a form that has undergone several hundred years of change. But if you peel back that change, which you can do with a little bit of linguistic work, you'll find that Shetland and Orkney have a complete Old Norse onomasticon. So it covers the coast, the inland area, the topographical features, the habitative or settlement names. They're all Norse. So you've got this fossilised, if you like, Old Norse onomasticon in the Northern Isles, which means that they are as Norse, when you're talking about place names, as Faroe Islands or Iceland. So, if you're measuring these things, I think that's quite important. It's important for identity that we can say in Shetland that our place names are as Norse as the place names of Iceland. That makes for a distinctive view of the identity. And if you say they're as Norse as Iceland, that makes them different from the place names of mainland Scotland. The identity is shared with Iceland, not with the mainland of Scotland. So you see the importance of place names coming out here. So, if we have this image then of Shetland, and by extension Orkney, having these Norse place name identity, let's have a look at some of the examples that we have. Again, the examples are just from Shetland here, but let's have a look at them and what they mean. Because if they're not commemorative, they're actually coined to associated with geographical formation, so they have meaning. So Shetland has a lot of these coastal generics. Generic is most place names are divided into two bits. You have your generic and your specific. So your generic is the thing like bay or river hill, and then the specific is what makes that particular bay, river, or hill different from another one. So that's like an adjective, if you like, put onto the generic. And the way that Old Norse place names work is that in most occasions you have the specific coming before the generic. So you have something like Burafirth. So the generic is the firth, which is from Old Norse fjordur, which means a fjord or a firth. But what specifies it, what makes it unique, is the Bura bit in front, which is Borgar. So Borgarfjordur would have been the original Old Norse form of the name before it changed, and that means the fort fjord. Borg is a fort, a fortified place. And then we have Laxfirth, and again you have your specific at the beginning, which means salmon. So that's the salmon fjord. These are most common. Some of the most common of the generics. We have quite a lot more. But another one is Vagur, which means bay, and that turns up all over Shetland. So you've got a firth, which is kind of a bigger version of this inlet of the sea, and then you've got the Vagur, or a Vo in the dialect nowadays, which is the smaller one. So we have Vo itself. That's called a simplex form of the name, so just the bay, if you like. One thing to say about place names and place name creation is that don't expect too much imagination in the creation of names. People were using them quite what's the word? They didn't take a lot of effort thinking out the meaning or creating of a name. If it was a bay, they called it bay. And then if they had to compare it with a different bay, one might be Big Bay, one might be Small Bay. But place names are created with quite a small perspective originally, it would seem. So the people that settled that in Vo just called their settlement area Bay. Okay. Where I live, Scalloway, is Skaulavag, which means something like the bay with a hall associated with it. And then probably the most famous Vagur name in Shetland is Solomvo, where the big oil and gas processing centre is. Another type of bay, what you're seeing here is the fact that the Norse had different types of words for different types of bays, so quite specific in how they describe a landscape feature. So Hopper, a small landlocked bay, gives Hubi. Vathel, a shallow place in water, gives Vidlin. Actually, Vathel is probably something to do with wading, so it's probably originally something you could wade across. And then we have Houghton Harbour, very important, of course, for people who had boats who wanted to find safe places to bring their boats in. And we have Hamnavo on Burra, and Hamsarö, which you've got a picture of down there in the Hamsarö. So it's nothing to do with lumps of meat. It's the havens of the island of Rö, which means something like the red island, as you can see from the colour there. The picture to the right-hand side, that's Burafirth. A few other coastal coastal generics. Ness, Dunrossness, Scatness, that's still a Ness, is a piece of land that sticks out. Nos, or Nos, is a nose, it's another piece that sticks out. Ave is Isthmus, sounded easier to pronounce the Old Norse word rather than the Greek one. But Ave gives aid as a settlement in Shetland, and also Spiggy. Now, Spigave was what that originally was, which means the sort of beaked or pointy isthmus. Virtually all the islands of Shetland have at the end the generic Øy, which just means island. Although over time it has, because it's not pronounced particularly strongly, it has tended to soften just into an A sound. So Øya, Bressa, Burra, Balsa. Øya is just the specific, in fact, it just means the island. Bressa is no one's quite sure what that means, but it might be called after an old Jarl of Orkney, Brucey actually. Burra was originally Borberey, which is the island of the fort, and Balsa is the island of the whale, Kvalsøy. And then we have another word, Skagi, just a projecting piece of land, Skaw on Unst. But there are more of these, but you can see that it was important to people to name the coastal features that they were interacting with all the time. And the final coastal generic to have a look at is Mini, which is the Old Norse word for a mouth. So Banamin, that's that mouth-shaped beach there on Burra. Just as all the coastal features have meanings and are coined by the Norse, so do all the inland features as well. And Shetland is a hilly place, and we find lots of examples of the Old Norse generic fell. This, of course, turns up in the north of England as well. It was borrowed from the Scandinavians who settled in that area. But we have lots of fells in Shetland. However, they tend to have been, they're sometimes not, if you don't know what you're looking for, you might not recognise them, okay? Because most of the hills actually end in field. But it wouldn't have been pronounced, well, it would have been actually Whofield in Cunningsborough. The LD bit is interesting because that reflects on the pronunciation of double L in the late form of the dialect of Old Norse spoken in Shetland. We have Fell in Unst, which is a farm called after the hill, and Fitvalhead, which is the big headland that sticks out from the south of Shetland into the sea towards Fair Isle. And that's an interesting one. The full bit is what's left of Fell, the hill, and the feet is probably from Old Norse Viti. Vitifjell is what they would have been originally, and that means fire hill. And it's believed that Fitvalhead was a place that they would have lit a big bonfire if the place was being attacked, and the message would have been seen from Fair Isle, and they would have lit a bonfire, and then it would have been seen from the north of Orkney. So a place name like that tells us something about the organisation of the population in the place as well, and a little bit about their fears and worries that they had to have this fire hill in a prominent position in the landscape. Dalur, the Old Norse word for a valley, or gives us English dale. There's lots of dales in Shetland as well. Usually it used to be pronounced dal, which was closer to the Old Norse form. So you find lots of examples of that. One that is redolent of Norseness, if you like, is Hamar. There's a place in Norway called Hamar. It was an old cathedral town, and it means a rocky wall. So if you look at a hill and you find a band of rock, like a sort of cliff, not necessarily like a cliff edge, but a band of rock going up the hill, these are hammers. And you'll find lots of hammers in Shetland. Just an example there, Hammers Land. I should also point out that a number of these generics were retained in the dialect of Shetland when people moved from speaking Norn to speaking Scots. They took words with them. So hammer existed in the dialect to describe a certain type of geographical feature for which there wasn't a Scots form. So they took the word with it. And dal, that was brought over as well. So you find quite a lot of them, particularly coastal names. You find these borrowings. Just another one here. Haugur means a mound or a cairn, and I've got a picture here of the Muckle in Unst, and that Hjog is from Haugur. Haugur can be a natural mound or a cairn, or it can also be one under which people are buried. So when you see the name, you think, interesting, I wonder if there's some interesting burial there. And in fact, there's a piece of folklore associated with the Muckle Hjog, that it's where a Viking called Harald was, Hender, I'm getting it wrong. It's at Haraldsvik, but a Viking called Hender was buried under the cairn of the Muckleheog. As you can see from this, unlike last week where we were sort of diminishing the impact of the Nordic in the identity of Orkney and Shetland, from the place names, we're really in a very, very Norse milieu. So here's a few others. Hol is the Old Norse word for hill, and you find hol or hul very frequently throughout Shetland. And where I live in Scalaba, every time I have to come up and over the hill to go to Lerwick, I have to go up the Skord. The Skord means a ravine, and the ravine is on Esterhul Hill. The highest hill in Shetland is called Ronus Hill, and Ronus takes its origin from hraun, which is a Norse word meaning stony or stony ground. And if you get the chance to go up to Ronus Hill, you will see that that is a very apt description of the place, because it's covered in enormous granite boulders. In the landscape, people had to get from one place to the next, so path or street in Old Norse was gata, and that's given us got in Shetland. And just like I mentioned the word for cairn, one of the other words for cairn, this word varða has given lots of place names in Shetland, including Saxavord, which you've got a picture there from the top of Saxavord looking across to Muckleslugga, the most northerly part of the British Isles. Saxavord means the cairn of someone called Saxi, and there's a piece of folklore about a giant called Saxi living on top of that hill and having a battle with a giant on the other hill that you can just make out on the other side of the fjord there, called Herman, and they used to throw big rocks at each other because they were in love with a mermaid who lived on Muckleslugga. So that was the way that they wanted to attract her attention, by chucking rocks at each other. Anyway, this varða you find in various forms associated with hills all over Shetland, suggesting that there must have been a system for setting up cairns, possibly again for keeping in communication with each other in case there were problems if people came sailing across over the hill. Now, you can divide place names in all sorts of different ways, but a sort of general way of doing it is to divide it into topographical names, which we've just been doing, and habitative names. Habitative names are those names which are very associated with settlements. So, in the sense that they're specifically meaning farm or house or something of that sort. And Shetland has a lot of these as well. Lots of garders, which means enclosure. So gardi, gardihus, setter. All these names you find in other parts of the Norse world as well. Well, land just means a farm, staðir, and bolstaðir, which gives us examples of Æsbistir and Keldabistir. The map that you see there is actually a map of all the bolstaðirs in Shetland. I could go into more detail about the difference between these types of names, but I think we'll just leave it just now. Enough to say that what you're seeing with these names is the increased settlement of Norse-speaking people within Shetland. The original farms that people established, they tended to give them topographical names. And once you get to the stage of coining a name with the word farm in some form after it, it's usually because this is when the settlement is being infilled and more people are spreading into the landscape. So you're seeing a kind of denseness, a density of settlement here when you look at these names. Bolstaðirs are also common in Norway, and it's an example of the use of the same type of generic. Other types of names that we get associated with habitation are bur, which comes out as be. So, just like in the north of England, where there are lots and lots of be names, And in Denmark, but there are lots and lots as well, we do have a few in Shetland as well, and it just means farm. So Melby means the middle farm. We know this because it turns up in a 15th century document, Medelbyr. Everby means comes from Old Norse Overby, so the over farm, the upper farm. Presumably when you have a settlement and then somebody builds a farm up the hill a little bit. And then Skali, meaning a hut or a hall. Skali in the Northern Isles probably means a hall more often than it means a hut. So Scalloway, we saw Scalloway already as a place with Vagur on the end, or bay, is the bay with the hall. And that's probably not surprising because it's a very protected bay, and certainly in the Middle Ages it became the place where, well, not the Middle Ages, in 1600 the Earl of Orkney had a castle built at Scalloway because it was an ideal place for administering Shetland. So it's not unlikely that there was something similar in the Viking period, a big hall with some kind of important Norse person living in it. And just to fill this page, we've got another one, Kvi, meaning a cattle fold. So that would originally be a place where people would just go to keep their cattle, but at some later point, somebody built a farm on it. So we have topographical names which are describing the landscape. We have habitative names which are referring to settlements that people have built farms on. But we also have other types of names too, which fill in a little bit of cultural, some interesting cultural aspects to our picture of Old Norse Shetland. We have place names in Thing, which means assembly, such as Tingwall and Nesting. Tingwall means the field of the assembly. And in tradition in Shetland, this is the place where every year there would be a court held, and at an earlier date, probably the Althing, when all the free population of Shetland would meet in this place, which is more or less the centre of Shetland, for their annual assembly, government get-together, discussion of various cases, marrying off the sons and daughters, etc. So it's a very important place. And Tingwall, you find it, this place name in Orkney as well. And you find, of course, a very famous example in Iceland, Thingvellir, which is still the home of the Icelandic Assembly and Parliament. So it tells us that the Vikings, once they'd settled in Shetland, soon established the administrative and cultural aspects of life that they had in Norway and that they took to other places that they settled. Herath is just associated with things. These are the districts in which you find a thing or an assembly, and we find several examples of that in the place names of Shetland too. But what we find lots of examples of is the place name Borg, meaning a fort, a fortified place. There are lots and lots and lots of them in Shetland. And the reason is that the place was absolutely covered in Iron Age fortifications when the Vikings got to Shetland. And they were often the most important and most obvious feature in any given landscape, and hence the places were called after them. And what I've got a picture there is Strandebroch, which is on Fetlar, and it is a fortified place. Strand is the same as the English word strand, so it's a beach fort, and it's a very interesting place, and actually very virtually impossible to access nowadays, but it was a fort at one point. And Sombra, we have a form of that. It was Sveinsborg, or Svinarborg, either the fort of somebody called Svein, a Viking who took it over, or the fort of pigs. It's difficult to know exactly which. But this Burg, or Broch, ending on a place name goes back to Old Norse Borg, and there are lots and lots of them. I actually should have a map made of them, but it would take a bit of effort, and well, I don't have time. But if you have a look at a map of Shetland, you'll find lots of these names. Other cultural generics which are intriguing and give us an insight a little bit into Norse society. There are there are two examples of Hof. Hof is usually translated as pagan temple when it occurs in Scandinavia. So we've got Hov and Hoof in Shetland, and there's no real reason to doubt that that's what they're referring to as well. So a place of importance for pagan Shetlanders before they became Christian. They've done studies on Hofs in Scandinavia recently, because they've actually found a couple of examples, one in Norway and one in Sweden. So they actually have started to get some idea of what these places looked like. And they've excavated one in Iceland as well, which was effectively a longhouse with a sort of altar in it that people were making blood sacrifices to. So who knows, maybe something similar in Shetland as well. Lund is again associated with pagan religion when looking at Scandinavia. And we have one example of that in Shetland, Lund, which I've got a picture of there. That's an old church dedicated to St. Olaf, going back to the 12th century. And although there are no trees in Shetland, there's a Lund, so a sacred grove. So quite an interesting word. So who knows what was going on there before the church was built. And one last one here is Thufa, meaning a mound. And it's not just any mound. Thufa is usually associated with a burial mound. So wherever we find examples of that in Shetland, these are places that have caught my eye, that there might be some pagan burial or something under a mound. There's a good example in Borough of this place named Tugs. The g bit at the end is a dialect bit added on, but originally it was Tu. And there's a hill close by as well called Tu Hill, Tu Field. The mountain with the mound on it. My particular interest in place names, one of my particular interests, I should say, is looking at supernatural beings in the landscape. And we have some examples of these from the place names as well. So we have the occurrence of that quintessential Norwegian supernatural being the Troll in the place name Trollwater. We have his wife, the Trollkona, in Trollkona which you've got a picture of there. Probably that's her face there. That's her nose and her chin. So that's her there. We also have examples of Thurs, or giant, Tirsawater, and Trusigyo on Skerries. And we have several examples of the Old Norse hag, or the Gigur, who would haunt various places in the place named Gorwell on Borough, and one or two other places in Shetland as well. So we know that the supernatural beings frequented the landscape of Shetland, as they did in Scandinavia. We also have a couple of names that occur in the sagas in Shetland, which also connect to this Nordicness, of course. And I'll pass on from this at the moment, but Baliasta in Unst is mentioned as Bollestadr in Orkneyinga saga, where there's a story about a woman who causes St. Magnus to be annoyed with her. So she goes mad and eventually has to go on a pilgrimage to Rome. Thorlak, who'd kicked her out of the house, made a promise for her, and that was a vow. He had to cast a lot to discover what he should promise: a pilgrimage to Rome, freedom for a slave, or a gift of money to the shrine of the holy Earl Magnus. Well, she went to the shrine of the Earl Magnus in Kirkwall and recovered her health, and then later went on a pilgrimage to Rome. So this is we're talking about the 12th century here. So it's not the Viking age, but it's the Norse period in Shetland. Turns up in Orkneyinga saga. Borgafjörður, there's a picture of Borgafjörður, Burafirth, that turns up as well. Earl Magnus and Haakon put to death a man of importance, Thorbjorn, at Burrafirth in Shetland. So what we're getting here, we're getting modern Shetland place names with an Old Norse origin that people are interested in the connotations and feeling they're Norse, and then we actually get vindication of this by the occurrence of these names in Icelandic sagas. So they are Norse names. Friðarey is the Old Norse form of the island name Fair Isle. And Fair Isle turns up quite a lot in Orkneyinga saga. It was an important place. So it turns up pretty frequently. Every time the Jarls of Orkney had to travel to Shetland, they had to pass Fair Isle, and every time the King of Norway had to come down to Orkney, King of Norway, he would come to Shetland, then he would pass Fair Isle. And so it does turn up quite frequently. I quite like this particular story. There was a man called the Dagfinn Hlodvisson, a stout-hearted farmer on Friðarey, charged with the task of guarding the beacon there and setting fire to it if the enemy fleet were to be seen approaching from Shetland. So he suffered a nasty fate, being hacked down with an axe near Kirkwall. But that's a good way for a Viking to go, I suppose. So we mentioned Fitfulhead on the southernmost point of Shetland. Well, that would have been a beacon. That would have been a beacon, then be a beacon on Fair Isle. So, we get mention of it in this saga. We'll read Musa for the moment. Another Norse connotation of these names, if what I've been saying it wasn't enough, is the existence of exactly the same names in other Nordic countries, which of course goes to make people feel they're in a Nordic milieu. So, Hvarf means a turning point, and we find quite a lot of different Hvarfs in the Norse world. There was a famous one on the southern point of Greenland, which is Cape Farewell now, but in the sagas it was Hvarf. You sailed across to Greenland, and then you turned up the coast of Greenland. There's a famous one on the north coast of Scotland, now called Cape Wrath, but it does come from the Old Norse word Hvarf. You sail across the top of Scotland, and then you turn and you sail down into the Hebrides. Well, that's what Hvarf must have meant as well. Maybe sailing up the Sound, you reach Hvarf, you can see Breslau in the distance, and you turn and you walk across and you sail a little bit further. Lots of examples of the place named Quam in Shetland, which means a little valley. You get an example like that in Kvamur in Iceland, which is a famous place in Dalasisla. Well, I think it's famous. You mentioned just now. A more obvious example, of course, is the reoccurrence of the place name Lerwick. Lerwick means clay, the bay with clay. Sometimes translated as muddy bay. That's a mistranslation. It's a bay in which you can get clay. And there are examples. There's an example in Faroe Islands, Lerwick, and there are several examples in Norway. One of them is Lervika, near where a friend of mine lives. We also get examples of Fula, the bird island, in different places. So there's Fugløy in Faroes and several Fugløy in Norway as well. And then Was on the west of Shetland means Vos, a place with several bays, and that occurs also in the Faroe Islands. Their version of it is Vagar, and that's where the airport is in the Faroe Islands. So you find these recurring names turning up in different places. Okay, so that's the main place names of Shetland. But another aspect of naming, which I think is quite intriguing, and I'd like to talk about as well, is how people use place names and what names they choose to call their houses. Okay, so it's a slight development of what we've been talking about, but it's also this is also part of onomastic studies, and it's intriguing to see how people express their identity through the names that they choose to give their houses. Okay, they've grown up in a landscape with this unique onomasticon, and you'll find that expressed in their desire to name their houses certain things. Well, first of all, let's start with the fact that not all houses in Shetland have unusual Shetland names. You do get the range of names that you would expect in other parts of Britain too. So you have a sort of overlap there. Some examples that you can see. You even get one or two. Well, there's one Gaelic place name there, Achnamara, and one Gaelic house name, Kjolnamara. The sound of the music of the sea. So you do get the names you would expect to find in other parts of Britain. So let's admit that. You also get some names in Shetland which relate to the British Empire, which you would also expect to find in other parts of Britain, like Delhi, Dinapore, Pretoria, which is on Ladysmith Road, so they're related to the Boer War. So you will find that because Shetlanders were keen imperialists, just like every other Briton at the time. So you will find examples of that. But what is distinctive is that you start to find place names names in Shetland for houses that could only be in Shetland. Okay, so you get, first of all, you get houses named after sort of a dominant geographical feature that they might be beside. Okay, so you get Tingwell House, which is near, it's right beside where the actual Thing site was, and it's in the so there's a house beside that, so it's not surprising. And there's another house that in the Tingwell Valley, which is called Ramnaberg, because the hill beside it is called Ramnaberg, and you can't get a more Norse name than that. That's Raven Mountain, okay, of Raven Rock. So it's a good name. But when we start to look at what people choose to call their houses, then we start to move into a very interesting world where people are choosing to express a sort of Nordic identity when it comes to their houses. So I've got a whole list of different types of commemorative names for you to think about. And think about, what if you were to call your house something, what would you call it? Or think about the communities in which you live yourself. What types of names have people chosen to call their house? I think once we've gone through this, I think you'll definitely agree that in Shetland, the Nordic, however you might define that, is very popular as a way of choosing names for houses. So this is the first lot. These are names of places in Shetland with a good Norse place name that's been chosen to commemorate the house. The name is commemorating a feature and then calling the house out. So Fiflagord, name of a house in Lerwick. Throlla is the name of a house in Scalloway. Throlla is actually a place in Borough which commemorates a troll, presumably, so that's a nice supernatural one. The Snug in Scalloway as well. The Snug is the one of the hills on Fulla, so it's a very important landscape feature. And we have Winjadepla in Lerwick. Winjadepla is a place in Fetlar associated with supernatural beings as well. So people have chosen what they feel are very Shetland names for their houses. Some people have chosen words from Norn, from the Old Norse language of Shetland, or from Shetland dialect, and some of the words that have come over from Norse. So there's a house in Hwarf called Mariel, I'm not sure what your house is called, Kathy. You have to tell us. Laybrick in Galberwick. Laybrick is sort of the shoreline. Something to do with the sea level anyway. Shoremal in Whiteness. That's the shore level. The Half in Hamnavo. The Half is the deep sea from the Old Norse word. And Vegapidi in Yell, which I'm not sure actually what that means, but it is from Norn. Some of these I do know what they mean though, of course, luckily. So the house in Yell called Yarta, and that means beloved. Bonhoga in Tingle. Bonhoga actually, it's the Norse version of barn. Well, it's from Barnhaga, a childhood garden. You know, the place where you played when you were a child. Vor means the spring. Simmerdim is the light that you get in the summer, where it doesn't get dark. Dala mist is the mist you get in the dales on a hot day. The mist starts to form, and flan is a type of wind that blows straight down and can knock you off your feet or blow out your fire in your chimney if it comes down. So people are choosing this identity to express through the name of their house, you see. Some people have a bit more humour, don't take this too seriously. So I quite fancy calling my house Mahoose, or Dunvargan. Now that's a clever one. Lots of place names in Scotland begin with Dun, and it means a fort in the Celtic languages. But in this case, Dunvargan just means finished messing about, is really what that means. And Kittle Naked, it's a very strange name. That means to be tickled while you're naked. So I don't know why, I don't know what that's supposed to be all about. Okay, so what other sort of Scandinavian, Nordic connotations are people being playing with when naming their houses? Well, direct connections with Norway in people choosing to call their house after a place in Norway. So we have a lot of different examples of that there, which you can think about. So Andøya, Geiranger, Ulvik, Svolvær, Torghatten, Tonsberg, Røros, Holmenkollen, Hammerfest, Trondheim, Øvredal. So what could be more obvious than choosing a connection with a Nordic country than actually choosing to call your house after a Norwegian place name? It's a very obvious statement. Other people have chosen a slightly different version, different way of doing it, so of drawing a connection with Norse identity. So a house in Yell is called Brattahlid. Brattahlid was the farm of Eric the Red in Greenland. And there's Jorvik, which is the Old Norse word for York. Geirhilda, it's a female name, and that's probably the origin of Gyrlsta, actually. Geirhilda Stader, the farm of someone called Geirhilda, who turns up in Heimskringla, actually, as the daughter of Floki, who Vilgerðarson, Raven Floki, who is supposed to have drowned in the loch in Shetland. Yarayem, interesting name there. Dagaz, that's one of the names of one of the old runes, the D runes. Well, some people have gone to some bother to try and choose a name with a Norse connotation. Mjolnir, that's Thor's hammer. Eigerstad, that's an interesting one. Eiger was the god of the sea. So Eigerstad looks like an old Norse place name, but it's a creation. Vanaheim, the home of the Vanir, the gods of fertility. Glipnir, that was one of the halls of one of the gods in Valhalla. And then Valhalla itself, there were several different versions. People have chosen that as the name of their house. And then, oddly, someone's chosen to call their house Ragnarök, which is, you know, the end of the world, the doom of the gods. So, quite a strange name. But people have chosen very carefully these names and their connotations and this, to express this Norse identity. Okay, just a few names just for fun. Since we're looking at the Norse place names of Shetland and this unique onomastic culture, there are some strange names in Shetland, it has to be said. Twat, well, you actually get twat in Orkney as well. So a twat is from Old Norse þveit, which means a clearing. So a clearing in the bushes, a clearing in the woods, or something of that sort. There's a Sodom in Walsa. I don't know what goes on there, but Sodom, it just means Sudheim. It was the southern farm at one point. And then buggery turns up in different forms in Shetland, but there's a clear buggery near the Brigawaz, and that's Búgarði, the fenced-in area of the farm, something of that sort. But of course, that comes out as something a bit humorous. Getting towards the end of this particular talk, but can't really end it without pointing out something else, which is fairly unique as far as place names go, as far as I'm aware, and certainly tell us something about the importance of Norse place names to Shetlanders and their cultural heritage. And that's the existence of etymological signs. So if any community in Shetland wants their place name put into Old Norse, it will be done for them. So here are 3 examples. And I don't know this happening anywhere else, as far as I'm aware, but it shows the importance of this this Norse idea to people, and the wanting to know what the right form or the original form of the name might have been. But of course, it's not always the case. I mean, Vinsgard, there's no real evidence that this is Vikingsgarður. It could be something else, but it will be a Norse name in origin. But I don't think there's any more telling sign of people wanting to express a Norse identity than going to the bother of creating etymological signs to find out what the original Old Norse of the name might have been. And what of Fografidl and Giltarump that I used as names for the talk? Well, Fografidl probably means beautiful, fagra, fiddle, fiddle. This is from Fell against so beautiful hill. And Giltarump, well, there's a picture of Giltarump there. That just means pig's bottom. And with that, I think we shall come to an end. I will try and come in next week, or this week rather, but I don't think I'll be able to. However, please watch the recording and discuss any of the ideas that have come out of it, and see if you can come up with comparative examples of people expressing identity through place names. So, thank you very much for watching.